First, we want to thank Bess Williamson for arranging this presentation. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to share our research with all of you and have a conversation about the histories embedded in this case study. Both Laura and I are co-founders of the group Repair. Repair is based out of the University of Minnesota, a land-grant university on stolen Dakota lands. To that point, we'd like to encourage folks in the audience to check out the organization Makoche Ikichupi, the Dakota Land Recovery Project, which is an opportunity for settlers to help finance the Dakota Nation buying back parcels of their ancestral homelands. Today, we are presenting our work on eugenics and euthenics at the Great Minnesota Get-Together. The image on this slide is an undated black and white photograph of the Minnesota State Fair entrance gate with people in the foreground. My name is Sarah Pawlicki. I'm a white settler with brown eyes and brown hair and a buzz cut. I'm wearing a dark brown shirt under a green patterned floral blazer, and my background is a white slatted screen and a white floral curtain. I'm a PhD candidate in history, studying the intersections of religious and labor history in the context of disability, queer, and Indigenous studies.
Hello, my name is Laura Leppink. I am also a white settler with blue eyes and long blonde hair and a ponytail. I am wearing a black shirt with a gray and blue blazer over it. In the background is our bookcases and an assortment of different lamps. I am an access assistant, public historian, and heritage conservationist at the University of Minnesota with interests in institutional, disability, and place-based histories. We first wanted to share a little bit of background about us and about the Repair Disability Heritage Collective. Our collective's logo is featured on the slide. Our logo is a line drawing in orange that can be perceived as both a small person sitting under an archway or as a keyhole in a stylized door. In addition to ourselves, our greater collaborative project includes Gail DeGrau, Chelsea Waite, Morgan Lacasse, Shauna Crossan, and Perry Meldon. Repair stands for Rethinking Equity in Place-Based Activism, Interpretation, and Renewal, which reflects our mutual commitment to inclusive historic preservation and historic preservation as reparative work, supporting place-based advocates for justice. In preservationist Sarah Marson's words, quote, "If historic preservation is not accessible, it is neither relevant nor revolutionary," unquote. Repair emphasizes holistic interventions in preservation planning, documentation, interpretation, accessibility, administration, and maintenance, and is motivated by knowing that no one single person associated with a historic site can make the needed changes alone. Disability has too often been framed as an issue only relevant to a small minority of individuals, requiring an institutional response only from designated access specialists. However, if, as feminist theorist Alison Kafer posits, disability is best understood through a political relational model in which, quote, "the problem of disability is located in inaccessible buildings, discriminatory attitudes, and ideological systems that attribute normalcy and deviance to particular minds and bodies," unquote. Dismantling inaccessible systems through political action becomes a mission in which we all can take part. Thus, Repair strives to address the access needs of people with disabilities in the present day, while simultaneously advocating for documenting and addressing disabled people's historic experiences and perspectives in site interpretation. We stand on the shoulders of giants and are inspired by works that include, but are not limited to, Tucson's Invalids, 10 Principles of Disability Justice, via Lakshmi Pyapsa Samarasinha and Stacey Park Milburn's Disability Justice and Audit Tool, Mass Actions Readiness Assessment and Toolkit, and Sarah Marson's work on dismantling historic preservation.
This is Sarah speaking again. Our presentation today revolves around these key themes and questions. First, we discuss the respective goals of eugenics and euthenics throughout the early 1900s and describe how these fields were gendered disciplines. Eugenics, defined as the practice or advocacy of controlled selective breeding of human populations to supposedly improve the average person's genetic condition, was a racist and ableist ideology that continues to inform contemporary discourse. Euthenics focused instead on external, environmental factors as the key to human betterment. Both fields shared the same ultimate goal, but saw the path to that goal differently. Second, we analyze how eugenic ideas were spread by institutional, formal education and popular education. The task of implementing eugenic policies across the state of Minnesota required widespread public buy-in. How did eugenicists try to amplify their message? Finally, we focus on the Minnesota State Fair to ask, how and why did the Minnesota State Fair circulate eugenic ideologies in a popular entertainment setting? A place-based history of the Minnesota State Fair shows how eugenic ideas were foundational to the fair's chosen location, professed mission, and intended audience.
This is Laura speaking again. In the words of our, we also wanted to make a note about Repair's interpretive methods. In the words of our collaborator, Perry Meldon, quote, every historic site, house, museum, national park unit have disability histories to tell, unquote. Ultimately, compassionate interpretation of historic experiences of disabled folks enhances our sense of belonging in public spaces. In order to start dismantling ableism in historic preservation, we have to understand what it looks like in the world around us. Drawing on abolitionist scholar T.L. Lewis's definition, we understand ableism to be, quote, a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism, unquote. As we come to this work, we realize that all of these different facets of identity and history are operative all the time. We believe that moving issues of human ability and disability to the center of our thinking offers an essential and corrective interpretive visions pitched towards the most able-bodied, affluent, employable, autonomous, and privileged individuals. Drawing on Sin's Invalid's first principle of disability justice, as well as Gail Dubrow's and John O'Gray's article, Taking Intersectionality Seriously, we understand the experience of disability is complicated by race, gender, sexuality, and class, which necessitates the use of intersectional and multidisciplinary lenses to understand how ableism operates systemically and identify interventions required to make historic properties and their respective disability stories accessible. Repair's work engages with disability studies to illustrate how different models of disability, ranging from the social model to medical model, are reflected in the built environment and landscape. The social model of disability highlights how people are disabled by their environments, making it a natural lens through which to view place-based history.
This is Sarah speaking again. With limited time today, our presentation will focus on our more tangible work related to mapping and interpretation of sites important in disability history. This slide features a draft image by Repair's graphic designer Morgan Lacasse of our collective's future website, which will be made public in mid-March of this year. Repair's goal of, quote, putting disability history on the map, end quote, is central to our project. Over the past couple of years, Repair has utilized story map case studies, such as the one we are sharing with you all today, on eugenics and euthenics at the Minnesota State Fair, to reimagine place-based history interpretation through the lenses of disability justice and critical disability studies.
This is Laura speaking again. So why story maps? Story maps can make place-based history accessible without demanding travel to a physical site. Particularly in the midst of a pandemic that makes travel a calculated risk, digital place-based interpretation provides COVID-safe option for sharing public history. Story mapping also offers opportunities for creating content for multiple audiences. Particular case studies focused on a single site can be written for different grade levels, different communities with different goals in mind. The relative brevity can make the genre more flexible and adjustable depending on the imagined audience using the website. We are also excited by the ability to include multimedia content in story maps, particularly when trying to envision an accessible, engaging website for a wide community of disabled people with varying access needs. The capacity to present textual, audio, photographic, and video content alike mattered to us as we selected a platform for which to expand our work. We're excited by the chance to fill in the gaps in traditional historic preservation methods by using an online platform for site interpretation. Places that no longer exist in the built environment, that have been torn down or fallen victim to neglect, can still be commemorated and interpreted via digital platforms. Exciting and cutting edge work is being done in historic preservation that encourages us to rethink and reimagine concepts that have, in the past, been integral to conventional historic preservation practices. For example, authenticity and integrity can both be categories that generally reflect privilege in their initial construction, maintenance, and historic designations. For communities with fewer socially granted privileges, their community spaces were frequently rented, transient, or less architecturally ornate than those of wealthy white folks. Instead of highlighting single sites, digital platforms are conducive to showing how places were networked and interconnected. For example, research into the Minnesota Eugenics Society, one of the primary entities at the crux of this presentation, revealed how the society was connected to the Twin Cities churches, private medical practices, the University of Minnesota's anthropology department and medical school, Stillwater Prison, and more.
This is Sarah speaking again. The Minnesota State Fair has taken place at several locations since its origin, and all of its locations were and are firmly rooted in Indigenous Dakota land. The image on the slide shows an illustration of a Dakota village located on a hillside sloping down toward a lake. A fitting picture, given that Minnesota's name is derived from the Dakota phrase Minnesota Makoche, or, quote, the land where the waters reflect the clouds, end quote. In the mid-19th century, in the midst of the chaos of the US-Dakota War provoked by colonial invasion and occurring at the same time as the US Civil War, the Minnesota State Fair was held at Fort Snelling at Bdote. Fort Snelling was a settler military outpost which became the site of a concentration camp incarcerating Dakota people. Bdote is a sacred place to the Dakota Nation, making their imprisonment there particularly painful. The Minnesota State Fair's entertainments were encircled by Fort Snelling's barracks and outbuildings, a reminder of the United States' military occupation of Dakota lands. Dakota people were then, by governmental decree, forced out of Minnesota and prohibited from returning to their homeland. Another native nation, the Ho-Chunk, were also exiled from Minnesota. The Ho-Chunk were uninvolved in the US-Dakota War, but lived on highly desirable farmland. Minnesotan politicians and investors were eager to purchase the land and took advantage of white settlers' prevailing hostility toward all Native people to violently banish the Ho-Chunk from the state as well. The Minnesota State Fairgrounds moved around after the US-Dakota War. The current fair site, located in Falcon Heights, once housed the Ramsey County Poor Farm, where impoverished Minnesotans could go to exchange their labor for a place to stay. The Poor Farm's grounds were then donated to the Minnesota State Agricultural Society for the specific purpose of hosting a state fair in 1885. Agricultural colonialism was at the root of the Minnesota State Fair's purpose, as white settlers sought prizes for the agricultural output grown on Dakota land. The Minnesota State Agricultural Society encouraged competition to determine who was producing the best livestock, the best fruits and vegetables, and the best preserves and fancy work. It was only a matter of time before that attitude spread to ideas about the display of the best human beings the state of Minnesota had to offer. The Minnesota Eugenics Society president Charles Dite wrote in a letter to the editor to the Star Tribune, quote, in the livestock exhibit at the Minnesota State Fair, a scrub cow is placed beside two fine Holstein cattle for contrast, and to show that by wise selection and breeding, a superior stock can certainly be produced that will yield more and better milk and increase the farmer's income. A question which I asked several exhibitors of stock, and which always caused a smile, was this: where on the fairgrounds is the building in which is exhibited a fine type and superior strain of human beings, purebred men and women, human thoroughbreds? End quote.
This is Laura speaking again. So why state fairs? The image on this slide is a notice that appeared in the 1915 annual report on the Minnesota State Fair, which reads, quote, "Are you interested in babies? Will you help us improve the most important crop raised in the state of Minnesota? Help save the lives of Minnesota babies. Enter your baby or help your neighbor's baby in the health contest at the Minnesota State Fair," unquote. State fairs play an important role in defining and reinforcing ideas and roles about citizenship. Especially in the progressive era, state fairs were a site of patriotic boosterism, reminding citizens of the state's best and most valued features and encouraging both state and national pride was a primary motivator behind the development of state fairs. Educating the public about these standards and ideals of citizenship was central to why the Minnesota Agricultural Society, founded in 1854, 4 years before Minnesota was granted statehood, viewed the fair as a critical educational institution and resource for the general public. The definition of citizenship, carefully crafted by the predominantly white men and later white women in power in the territory and state, was confined to white settlers and their agricultural way of life and civilization. From its inception, the Minnesota State Fair was a colonial institution. It sought to further the efforts of white settlers and teach Minnesotans how a proper citizen looked and acted. These notions of settler colonialism and white supremacy were perpetuated over time through new ideologies and dovetailed well with the rise of eugenics following his introduction by Francis Galton in his 1883 book, Inquiries into Human Fertility and Its Development. With inseparable ties to racism, misogyny, classism, and settler colonialism, eugenics offered an effective approach to reinforce the positions of those in positions of power across the state. And the Minnesota State Fair was the steadfast venue in which to share these ideas with the white public. The early eugenics movement in the 1900s informed the development of Minnesota State Fair. In the 1908 annual report of the Minnesota State Agricultural Society titled "The Minnesota State Fair of 1908 and the Future," the opening address was by Frank A. Weld, president of the State Normal School at Moorhead, and his speech was titled "The State Fair as an Educational Institution." Weld's address offers a clear picture of the role and place of non-white people in the state, and by default, places like the Minnesota State Fair. Weld outlined the role of the Minnesota State Fair played in the development of Minnesota, stating, quote, "The Minnesota State Fair has been, since its inception, a medium of expression, and the state has gained in power of material resources, moral fiber, and intellectual acumen. This expression of effort, material and intellectual, has come to assume gigantic proportions. The growth of the state fair as an institution has been consistent with the continued and marvelous development of the state," unquote. Much like the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota State Fair also predates statehood. While institutions such as the University of Minnesota were not accessible to many Minnesotans, the State Fair offered an alternative educational space for all Minnesotans to participate in shaping the future of the state. And to reiterate that the meaning of all for the Agricultural Society of Minnesota, however, only meant colonizers. Later in his address, Weld reinforces this notion by describing an indigenous person as, quote, "the lazy Indian who fled in terror from the great fire ship had possessed in peace for centuries these same fertile prairies, yet he had obtained from them a few paltry tusks of Indian corn," unquote. Later explaining that, quote, "it was left for a more progressive race to develop the resources of this territory. The white man came and he wrung from reluctant nature abundant crops," unquote. Although not referencing explicitly the promotion of white superiority and its supposed benefits to the state, reveal how eugenics and scientific racism made their way into general discourse.
This is Sarah speaking again. The image on this slide is a map showing the Minnesota Fairgrounds in 1923, the year Charles Dyke founded the Minnesota Eugenics Society. White men dominated the conversation about eugenics in legislative and academic contexts, which in turn was translated through their stewardship of the Agricultural Society and State Fair. Middle to upper class white women directly advocated for eugenics in the sphere in which they had the greatest authority, the home. As the protectors of social and cultural values through their crucial role of mothering the next generation, women could participate in eugenic marriages designed to produce quote-unquote race betterment, surround their infants with tools designed to produce better babies, and educate their children about the significance of quote-unquote sex hygiene, so they, too, would make eugenically informed reproductive choices. The home economics movement emphasized women's capacity to affect child development outcomes through nurture as a more hopeful complement to primarily male geneticists' emphasis on nature as a fixed outcome. The home economist Ellen Swallow Richards originated the term euthenics to encapsulate the movement's relationship to ideas about human progress rooted in the eugenics movement. Richards defined euthenics as, quote, the betterment of living conditions through conscious endeavor for the purpose of securing efficient human beings, end quote. This betterment would occur in stages. In her words, quote, eugenics deals with race improvement through heredity. Euthenics deals with race improvement through environment. Eugenics is hygiene for future generations. Euthenics is hygiene for the present generation. Eugenics must await careful investigation. Euthenics has immediate opportunity. Euthenics precedes eugenics, developing better men now, and thus inevitably creating a better race of men in the future, end quote. The 1914 Minnesota State Fair was a pivotal moment for women's participation in fair planning and marked the formation of the Public Welfare Department. The committee included 6 women and was chaired by Mrs. Bertha Dahl Laws as superintendent of the Department of Public Welfare. The divisions of the department included a rest cottage, program and entertainment, household economics, a baby health contest, day nursery, emergency hospital, child welfare exhibit, and a health exhibit. Beyond her role in chairing the Public Welfare Department for the State Fair, Dahl Laws was also known as a prominent lecturer and writer on domestic science and industrial education, giving lectures across a number of states and even in Canada. She was listed as a faculty member and lecturer on domestic science at the Northern Normal and Industrial School, as well as the Mankato Normal School, which is now Minnesota State University. In her report, Dahl Laws addressed the need for dedicated space and attention to educating the public about the, quote, welfare of men, women, and children of the great state of Minnesota, end quote. She pointed out that, quote, the welfare of men, women, and children of the great state of Minnesota seems to be of small interest to the state if one is to judge by the absence of any building dedicated to that work on the state fairgrounds, end quote.
This is Laura speaking again. In partial answer to Dahl Law's complaints, the Women's Building was constructed on the state fairgrounds. This slide shows a postcard of the Women's Building, a large brick building with ornate and classical detailing, and a whopping 10 American flags flying from its roof. The crowd surrounding the building is shown to be full of well-dressed people, men and women, out to enjoy a day's entertainment at the fair. The Women's Building was a hub for domestic science displays intended to interest the modern women. Blending education with entertainment was a key part of the formula for engaging audience members. It featured displays of new technology for taking care of the household, baking competitions, needlework exhibits, fashion displays. Better baby contests were a prominent pathway for both educating the public about what factors composed a better baby and for instilling winners of the baby contests with pride in their genetically excellent progeny.
This is Sarah speaking again. There are two images on this slide. The upper left image is a newspaper clipping which reads, quote, "Woman's building, busy place at fair. Exhibits are varied," end quote. The lower right image is a newspaper clipping showing three women demonstrating how to use various kitchenware at the state fair. Bertha Dahl Laws was at the heart of efforts to refine the entertainments and educational materials available to Minnesota citizens in the Women's Building. In her efforts to more permanently establish spaces to learn about human welfare, she spoke at the 1914 Minnesota Agricultural Society meeting on the state fair and noted, quote, "The importance of horticulture, fruits and vegetables to the state is being more and more appreciated, and the beautiful horticultural building on the state fairgrounds convinces one that this is realized. But the value of human lives seems to be underestimated. The importance of comfortable homes seems to be less appreciated, and the welfare of men, women, and children of the great state of Minnesota seems to be of small interest to the state." Laws, end quote. Law's analysis pushed the Agricultural Society to acknowledge how their choices for the state fair's built environment, forms of education, entertainment, and educational opportunities determined what Minnesotans valued in the moment, as well as for the future of their families, communities, and the state. At the fair, Bertha Dahl Laws resented that the significant exhibits, like those on child welfare programming and the eugenic charts drawn up by Dr. A.C. Rogers of the Faribault School for the Feeble-Minded, were, quote, "sandwiched," end quote, between displays showing women new ways to prepare jello and use yarn. It seemed to her that this kind of proximity lessened the importance and impact of the serious work being done at the Women's Building. This kind of normalizing, though, making the rudiments of eugenics seem as mundane and as palatable as displays of cookery innovation, was a key part of what made the ideological work of better baby contests so powerful.
This is Laura speaking again. The Minnesota Eugenics Society, led by Charles Dite, was entirely composed of white men. As indicated by the debate over euthenics and eugenics, though, the formal membership roles aren't necessarily reflective of white women's actual engagement with eugenic ideologies. For instance, it is likely that many of the wives of Minnesota Eugenics Society members are also ardent eugenicists, but simply express their enthusiasm for the cause in the domestic sphere, rather than in the formalized public sphere. Dite's ideology was widespread, popularly accessible in mainstream venues, and extensively networked. The map pictured on this slide shows the addresses of Minnesota Eugenics Society members across the state, as well as significant locations in the movement, including places like the University of Minnesota's Anthropology Building, the Faribault School for the Feeble-Minded, and the Minnesota State Fairgrounds. The majority of the Minnesota Eugenics Society members were embedded in academia, medical institutions, or even in the prison system. The reach of the Minnesota Eugenics Society can be exemplified by member Frederick Coleman. Coleman found numerous venues in which to promote eugenic ideology, including as the superintendent of the Minnesota State for the Feeble-Minded, professor in educational psychology at the University of Minnesota, director of the Division of Research under the State Board of Control, and even participated as one of the physicians for the Minnesota State Fair Better Baby contests.
This is Sarah again. This slide shows a picture of Minnesotan mothers with their babies, sitting on the steps of a house, preparing to determine how their progeny ranked in terms of genetic excellence. Charles Dite spoke to the role fairgrounds and Better Baby contests could play in a November 13th, 1923 Minneapolis Star letter to the editor. Quote, Baby shows at county fairs should be held, and whole family groups should be encouraged to compete, with special reference to developing hereditary soundness and fine quality. These to be determined by physical and mental tests, which should include character, kindness being one of the most important and valuable characteristics. Other most essential traits for good general behavior are conscience, caution, reasoning ability, or good judgment. End quote. Given the prevailing contemporary heteronormative gendered social roles of the day, women were tasked with the primary responsibility for reproducing a fit generation of babies capable of perpetuating the kind of race betterment program Dite envisioned. Dahl Laws agreed that it was vital to instruct women how to bring up their children right, saying in the 1914 Minnesota State Fair annual report, quote, "I think the State Fair should be a leader in the state help of Minnesota. So many people, too, never reach our excellent educational systems. They stay right in the home. Then, the only teacher, doctor, and nurse is the mother in the home. So we have to train the one important factor in civilization, the mothers of Minnesota." End quote.
This is Laura speaking again. The spaces designed to house the Better Baby contest communicated their purpose, intended audience, and underlying logics. The Minnesota Department of Welfare reported in 1915 in a synopsis of the work done under Bertha Dahl Law's leadership, quote, the most striking feature of the work of this department was undoubtedly the baby health contest and the child welfare exhibit. The contest was conducted in a glass cage 20 by 20 in the center of the women's building. 3 sides were of glass, the fourth side opening into 2 dressing rooms. Each baby was examined in full view of the public. The physicians and the nurses in their white uniforms were the only ones allowed in this cage, unquote. The Better Baby contest, by dint of its centralized location in the women's building, served as the core feature of the women's department. The large glass cage used to host Better Baby contests emphasized that they were intended to be educational, hence being performed in front of an interested speculators who happened to be walking by. White-coated medical professionals lent the competition an air of scientific authority, bolstered by the appearance of Dr. A.C. Rogers, the superintendent at Baraboo School for the Feeble-Minded, who delivered lectures about eugenics at the women's building.
This is Sarah speaking. Minnesota Eugenics Society President Charles Dite conceptualized eugenics using a structural, design-based metaphor. He stated in a 1933 radio lecture that, quote, "Heredity is the great power that it is because it fixes during the 9 months of life before birth the structure of the brain, through whose nerve cells the mind acts. Heredity, figuratively speaking, is the architect of the house your mind must live in." End quote. According to him, the fundamental building block of eugenics had to be genetics. There was only so much external factors, like the environment or education, could do in terms of race betterment. Embedding eugenic ideas into popular venues was critical to making this radical change to US society. Eugenicists knew that their ideology could not be confined to the figurative ivory tower if they were to produce the results eugenicists wanted. Leaders of the eugenics movement were preoccupied with how they could most efficiently circulate their ideas to popular audiences. Dite wrote in a Star Tribune letter to the editor, quote, "A wider spread and profound interest must be stimulated in the recognition and analysis of the biological factors in civilization, and existing knowledge must be placed in the hands of teachers, preachers, lecturers, in a suitable form to retail to the public." End quote. Only widespread buy-in from a broad sector of the public would make the race betterment programs he envisioned a possibility. State fairs were considered to be an excellent venue for popularizing eugenic ideologies through a combination of education and entertainment. Fairgrounds were a convenient way to capture the attention of big audiences. It was one wing of the Minnesota Eugenics Society's educational programming, alongside formal institutional higher education, like at the University of Minnesota, radio lectures, and home economic workshops. Dite stressed that, quote, the essential facts of eugenics should become as familiar as the multiplication table, end quote. Keeping eugenics at the forefront of public consciousness through popular media and popular entertainments like the State Fair was critical to the quest to make the pillars of eugenics ubiquitous across the state. Thank you very much, and we will now open up for questions. 35 minutes and 27 seconds.